Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today our mission is, well, it's huge. We're diving into the history of Australia.
And that means juggling two timelines that are just worlds apart, doesn't it?
Exactly. You've got the modern nation, the Commonwealth, formed in 1901, so less than 125 years old.
Uh-huh. And then you have the first Australians, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Their history on the continent stretches back, well, maybe 65,000 years.
It's staggering, one of the oldest continuous cultures anywhere on Earth.
Right. And understanding that sheer contrast, that deep time versus the relatively recent political creation, that's really key to grasping modern Australia.
Yeah, it shapes everything. So this deep dive, it's your shortcut to understanding all of it, the ancient history, the impact of colonization, why the colonies federated, and the ongoing struggles right up to that recent voice referendum.
Okay, so where do we begin? Has to be the deep past, right?
Absolutely. 65 millennia ago. It's almost impossible to really get your head around that kind of time depth.
It is. We're talking about the first migrations onto Sahol, that ancient landmass connecting Australia and New Guinea.
When sea levels were much lower.
Exactly. People arrived maybe 50,000, maybe even 65,000 years ago. They came from Southeast Asia, using land bridges where they could, and making these, pretty risky, short sea crossings. An incredible journey.
And we have solid archaeological proof for these dates, don't we?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sites like Majid Bebe up in the Northern Territory. The dating there is pretty firm at around 65,000 years.
Wow.
And then there's Lake Mungo down in New South Wales, around 41,000 years old. And that site has evidence of one of the world's oldest known cremations.
Which tells you so much about ritual, belief, social complexity, even that long ago.
Precisely. It just completely undermines that old colonial idea of terra nullius, of an empty land waiting to be claimed.
So what did that pre-contact society look like before 1770?
Well, it was incredibly diverse and complex. Population estimates vary, maybe 300,000, perhaps up to 1 million people, divided into around 600 distinct nations or clan groups, and maybe 250 different languages being spoken. It was a continent teeming with culture.
And highly adapted societies, not just simple hunter-gatherers as sometimes portrayed.
Not at all. They had sophisticated land management, like fire stick farming to manage ecosystems. They developed extensive trade routes.
Yeah.
Ochre, for example, a really important ceremonial pigment, was traded over distances of maybe 250 kilometers.
Right.
And look at infrastructure. In Western Victoria, there's evidence of these amazing eel and fish trapping systems, complex channel networks, some stretching for like 3 kilometers.
Incredible engineering.
It really was.
Yeah.
And underpinning all this was their spiritual framework, often referred to as the dreaming.
Can you explain that a bit? It's more than just mythology, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The dreaming is the foundational era.
Yeah.
It's when ancestral beings shaped the land, the people, the animals, and laid down the laws, the kinship systems, the ceremonies, everything that governed life and connection to country.
So it's law, history, spirituality, all woven together.
Exactly. And we should also mention the Torres Strait Islander peoples up north between Queensland and New Guinea. They have their own distinct cultures, maritime traditions, they practiced horticulture, and had villages established by the 14th century, culturally separate from mainland Aboriginal groups.
Okay, now I remember reading about a debate. Something about a second migration wave, maybe 4,000 years ago, linked to dingoes and languages.
Ah, yes, that
Yeah.
theory. It was quite prominent for a while. You see, around 4,000 years ago, several things seem to happen. The dingo appears in the archaeological record, new types of stone tools emerge, and the Pama-Nyungan language families start spreading rapidly across most of the continent.
Right, so people wondered if new arrivals brought those changes.
Correct. But more recent genetic studies looking at ancient DNA, they haven't really found strong evidence for a major second migration wave back then. The consensus now leans towards the first big arrival, 50,000 or more years ago being the main one. Those later changes were likely internal innovations and adaptations.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's jump forward, thousands and thousands of years. We arrive at 1770. James Cook.
Lieutenant James Cook, yep. Sailing up the East Coast, and this is where those two timelines collide, dramatically.
And his instructions. I mean, it's startling to read them now. He was supposed to take possession only with the consent of the natives.
That's what the Admiralty ordered. But it's not what happened. His very first landing at Botany Bay involved conflict. 2 Gweagal men resisted the landing party, and one was shot with a musket.
So consent wasn't obtained. Not even close.
No. Cook went on to claim the entire East Coast for Great Britain under the doctrine of terra nullius, basically arguing it was land belonging to no one, a legal fiction that ignored the 60,000 years of prior occupation.
And then 18 years later, 1788, the first fleet arrives in Sydney Harbor. What was the immediate impact?
Catastrophic, really. Beyond the initial violence and dispossession, which was significant, the biggest killer was disease.
Right. Introduced diseases they had no immunity to.
Exactly. Smallpox hit Port Jackson in 1789, just a year after arrival. It wiped out huge numbers of the local Eora people. Some estimates suggest disease alone caused population declines of up to 80% in certain areas within just a generation or two of contact.
80%. That's an unimaginable loss. Loss of life, culture, knowledge.
Absolutely devastating. It shattered communities, broke kinship lines, wiped out elders who had crucial knowledge. It made organized resistance much, much harder.
But there was resistance. The Australian Frontier Wars.
Yes, definitely. This wasn't a peaceful settlement. There was prolonged conflict across the continent, often brutal, lasting well into the 20th century in some remote regions. Think of figures like Pemulwuy leading resistance around the Hawkesbury and Nepean rivers near Sydney in the 1790s and early 1800s. The overall death toll estimates are stark. Maybe 1,700 to 3,000 settlers killed, compared to perhaps 17,000, maybe even 30,000 Aboriginal people.
A massive disparity.
Yeah.
And alongside the violence came policies of control, assimilation.
That's right. It shifted from outright conflict to more institutional forms of control. As early as 1814, Governor Macquarie set up the Native Institution. The stated aim was to civilize Aboriginal children, basically remove them from their culture. And that impulse became formalized later in the century with the establishment of protection boards, starting in Victoria in 1869. These boards had immense power.
What kind of power?
Almost total control over Aboriginal people's lives, where they could live, who they could work for, their wages, whether they could travel. And, critically, laws like the Victorian Half-Caste Act of 1886 gave authorities the explicit power to remove children of mixed descent from their families.
The beginnings of the stolen generations.
Exactly, setting the legal and administrative framework for that devastating policy.
Okay, let's switch tracks now to the other timeline, the path towards Australia becoming a single nation. Before 1901, it wasn't one country at all, was it?
Not even close. You had 6 separate British colonies: New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania. And they operated like, well, almost like independent little countries.
How so?
They each had their own government, their own laws, their own small defense forces, even their own postage stamps.
Right.
And crucially for trade, they each collected customs duties, tariffs on goods crossing the borders between them. If you ship something from Melbourne to Sydney, you pay tax at the border. They even had different railway gauges in some places, making train travel a nightmare.
Sounds incredibly inefficient. What finally pushed them towards uniting? What were the big drivers?
You can really boil it down to maybe 4 main factors, mostly driven by practical concerns and, well, anxieties.
Okay, what's number 1?
Economics, free trade. Business leaders, farmers, they were desperate to get rid of those internal tariffs and create a single large domestic market. That was probably the biggest practical driver.
Makes sense. What else?
Defense. By the late 1800s, there was growing concern about the colonies being vulnerable, especially with other European powers active in the Pacific. An 1889 report strongly recommended creating a unified national defense force.
Right, to strengthen numbers.
Exactly. Third, and this is a really significant and uncomfortable one, was immigration.
The desire to control who came into the country.
Precisely. There was widespread anxiety, particularly after the gold rushes, about cheap non-white labor, especially directed towards Chinese immigrants. Many leaders believed a national government would be much more effective at creating and enforcing restrictive, racially based immigration policies.
Which led directly to the White Australia policy after Federation.
It was one of the explicit goals. And the fourth driver was a growing sense of national pride or identity. By the turn of the century, something like 3/4 of the population had been born in Australia. People were starting to think of themselves as Australian, not just as British subjects living overseas.
So a mix of pragmatism, fear, and a budding sense of identity. Who were the key players pushing this forward?
Well, Sir Henry Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales, gets a lot of credit for giving the movement momentum with a famous speech in Tenterfield in 1889.
The Tenterfield Oration.
That's the one. And figures like Edmund Barton, who became the first prime minister, captured the mood with slogans like, "A nation for a continent and a continent for a nation."
And the actual structure of the government. The Constitution.
The framework was largely hammered out at conventions in the 1890s. Sir Samuel Griffith, Queensland's premier, was a key draftsman. He heavily relied on a draft prepared by a Tasmanian delegate, Andrew Inglis Clark, who was a big admirer of the American federal system.
So that's where the model of shared power between federal and state governments, federalism, came from, and the two houses of parliament, the House and Senate.
Largely, yes, along with an independent high court to interpret the Constitution. But getting the public across the line wasn't straightforward.
You needed referendums,
Yeah.
right? In each colony.
Yes, and it took 2 rounds. The first one in 1898 actually failed because New South Wales didn't reach the minimum yes vote threshold they'd set for themselves.
So they had to negotiate.
They did. Concessions were made a key, one being the promise that the future national capital would be located within NSW territory, though not too close to Sydney. That helped get NSW voters on board for the second round of referendums in 1899.
And most colonies agreed then.
Most did. Western Australia was the holdout. They were geographically isolated and worried about being dominated by the eastern colonies. They only agreed to join at the very last minute, holding their referendum after it was clear the others were going ahead anyway.
And so, the Commonwealth of Australia was proclaimed on January 1st, 1901, a new nation.
A new nation, yes, but one whose constitution barely mentioned the continent's first peoples, except largely to exclude them. That story of recognition and rights would take much, much longer.
When did that start to change significantly?
Things began shifting gradually, often spurred by external events. World War II, for instance, saw Indigenous Australians playing a bigger role in the war effort, in defense industries, and gaining better access to things like Social Security pensions afterwards. This raised awareness and expectations.
But the major turning point politically was the 1967 referendum, wasn't it?
Absolutely huge. A landmark moment. You had over 90% of Australians voting yes, still the highest yes vote in any Australian referendum.
Incredible consensus. What did it actually change in the Constitution?
2 key things. First, it allowed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be included in the national census count, finally recognized officially as part of the population. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it gave the federal government the power to make laws specifically for Aboriginal people, taking that power away from the states, which had often used it neglectfully or harmfully.
So it shifted responsibility at the national level. Did that pave the way for land rights?
It certainly created the political space for it. The fight for land rights had already begun, of course. You had powerful actions like the Yolngu people sending their bark petition to Parliament in 1963. The famous Wave Hill Walk-Off in 1966 when Gurindji stockmen went on strike for fair wages and land rights. These actions built pressure.
And then came the big legal challenges. Mabo.
The Mabo decision in 1992. Absolutely fundamental. The High Court overturned terra nullius. It ruled that native title, the rights and interests of Indigenous people in land according to their traditional laws and customs, had survived colonization and still existed in Australian law where it hadn't been legally extinguished.
It shattered the legal basis on which Australia had been claimed.
Completely, a legal and symbolic earthquake. But then it got complicated again almost immediately with the Wick decision.
Right. Wick in 1996. What was that about?
Wick dealt with whether native title could coexist with pastoral leases, these huge land grants common across much of Australia. The court found that, yes, in some cases, a pastoral lease didn't necessarily extinguish all native title rights. They could potentially coexist.
Which must have created huge uncertainty for farmers and miners.
It did. It led to years of complex negotiations and legislation trying to sort out how these different rights would interact on the ground. But the overall result of Mabo, Wick, and subsequent native title claims has been significant. By 2021, Indigenous Australians held recognized native title rights, either exclusive or shared, over about 54% of the Australian landmass.
Wow, over half the country. Yet, despite these massive legal gains, we still hear about the gap, right? Persistent disadvantage.
Sadly, yes. The Closing the Gap reports track progress on key indicators of Indigenous well-being, health, education, employment, housing. While there's been some progress in areas like, say, early childhood education enrollment, the 2020 report showed the gap was actually widening in really critical areas like child mortality rates, employment levels, and adult literacy. So legal recognition hasn't automatically translated into social and economic equality. There's still a long way to go.
Which brings us right up to date. We had the National Apology to the Stolen Generations in 2008, and then the push for constitutional recognition through the voice.
That's right. The proposal, developed over years of consultation culminating the Uluru Statement from the Heart, was to amend the Constitution to recognize Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the First Peoples and establish an advisory body, the Voice, to give them input on laws and policies affecting them.
But that referendum, in October 2023, failed.
It did. A majority of Australians and a majority of states voted no. So the questions of constitutional recognition, structural reform, and how best to achieve self-determination and close those persistent gaps, they remain very much alive and unresolved.
Okay, let's pivot one last time. How do Australians, or at least the experts, judge the leaders who built and shaped this modern nation? You mentioned those Monash University surveys.
Yeah, they're interesting. Academics periodically rank the post-Federation prime ministers. There's a fair bit of consensus at the top.
Who usually comes out on top?
John Curtin, the wartime leader during World War II, is almost always ranked number one, seen as incredibly effective under pressure, and he helped plan post-war reconstruction. Bob Hawke, who drove major economic reforms and consensus politics in the 80s, also ranks very highly.
Right.
And Alfred Deakin, who was prime minister 3 times in the first decade, is consistently up there too. He's seen as the key architect of many of the foundational institutions of the new nation: arbitration, tariffs, defense policy.
What's the main thing the experts value? Is it just being in power a long time?
No, not really. The surveys explicitly ask experts to rate different criteria, and policy legacy consistently comes out as the most important factor. What did they actually achieve? Did it last? Did it shape the nation?
So long-serving PMs who didn't have major reform legacies might not rank as highly.
Exactly. That's why people like Joseph Lyons or Stanley Bruce, who both served for long periods, generally don't make that top tier. Longevity isn't enough. It's about enduring impact.
And who tends to end up at the bottom of these rankings?
Well, William McMahon consistently ranks very poorly, and more recently, Tony Abbott has joined him at or near the bottom.
Why them?
For Abbott, the experts scored him very low on policy legacy, but also notably low on things like managing his own party or coalition and fostering national unity. It suggests that, in the experts' view, effective leadership requires not just policy vision, but also political management skills.
Okay, so we've covered an immense sweep. From 65,000 years of continuous culture enduring ice ages and invasion.
Through to the messy, pragmatic, sometimes prejudiced birth of a nation driven by tariffs and defense fears in 1901.
And ending with today's ongoing debates about recognition, rights, and reconciliation.
It's quite a journey, and if you think about it, that Mabo decision in 1992 finally overturning terra nullius, it was the first time the legal and political system of the Commonwealth truly acknowledged the reality of that 60,000-year occupation, an occupation the founders in 1901 had essentially chosen to ignore in the Constitution.
So here's something to leave you with. Modern Australia was forged in 1901, driven largely by economic needs and social anxieties of that specific time. But the foundational legal recognition of the continent's first people didn't happen until 1992, almost a century later. How does a nation reconcile its modern political structure, created in one context, with the much deeper pre-existing reality of land and its original inhabitants acknowledged so much later? That, perhaps, is the fundamental challenge Australia continues to grapple with today.